Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art. My name is Simon Elliott. I'm the Deputy Director here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land upon which we meet, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Given that we're in an art gallery, I thought I'd add to that to thank and acknowledge Aboriginal people for the incredible impact their creativity gives to the visual culture of Australia and this country. Thank you for joining us tonight for this discussion, which is held in conjunction with the Gerhard Richter show, Life of Images. This is an exclusive to Brisbane show. I hope all of you have seen it, because this is the first major exhibition of Richter's work ever to be held in Australia, and I can tell you that there won't be anybody mad enough or courageous enough to do it again in our lifetime. It's been a fantastic exhibition to work on, and we're really pleased with the results, and this event is really part of trying to extend the value of that show, so make sure you tell your friends. This evening we're very lucky to be joined by Australian artist Ben Quilty. Ben grew up and is based in Sydney and continues to draw critical acclaim both nationally and internationally, including winning the Archibald Prize in 2001 with, we call her a Queenslander, Margaret Olley. Mm-hmm. He is noted, you were happy with that, Queenslander, Margaret Olley? Good. He is noted for his heavily impastoed canvases that explore social issues. On level 3, as many of you will know in GOMA, we have his very haunting image of Sergeant P after Afghanistan, purchased in 2014 thanks to our foundation. And last year, Ben was invited by World Vision Australia to travel to Greece, Serbia and Lebanon to witness firsthand the international refugee crisis. Throughout this evening's program, Ben will reflect on his own practice and the place of painting in contemporary art, drawing inspiration from Gerhard Richter, The Life of Images exhibition. Joining Ben, thankfully, will be former director and curator of Griffith Artworks, Griffith University, Beth Jackson, who is now contemporary art curator and director of the Brisbane-based art consultancy Artfully. Beth recently wrote the essay for Ben Quilty's exhibition at Jan Murphy's gallery titled The Last Supper. At the end of the conversation, we've got time for some questions, but please, if you could join in by welcoming both Ben and Beth. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and what a treat to see this exhibition. It's a fantastic show. To see the works in the flesh, I'm sure many of you have, like myself, have only seen them in reproduction. And to have somebody like Ben to bounce it all off and see what we think about it. I thought maybe we could start with the relationship between painting and photography. Obviously, that is central to the exhibition and central to Richter's practice. Richter seems to make sense of one medium through the other, and through these extrinsic forces of representation. So it's almost like between painting and photography, the image kind of emerges as an artefact. But I wanted to ask you how important photography is to your practice. Do you use photographs, and in what way?
It's a very good question, and Richter, I guess, is the perfect means through which to talk about something like photography and painting. I went to art school at Sydney College of the Arts in the early 90s, and it was after an infamous essay about the end of painting, art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And I was in the painting department of one of the major art schools in Sydney, but there literally was no paint in the whole studio system. No one was making paintings with paint. In fact, I remember one artist who's gone on to great things, made a really amazing painting using different shaped, coloured dog biscuits. And I, at the time, just thought, I don't want to use fucking dog biscuits. I really want to use paint. I liked paint when I was about 3 or 4, and I've still never stopped loving the material. But Richter was, at that time in the early 90s, sort of fought over between both camps that were fighting Clement Greenberg's essays about the art in the age of mechanical reproduction, that painting was dead, which follows on from Warhol and the end of postmodernity and all those sorts of things. And the others, who at that time weren't very apparent to me, but really Richter was right in there as one of those people who said that painting absolutely exists and will continue to exist. There's this cave-like quality to the use of pigment that comes out of the earth and the most instantaneous way to make a mark, but it's impossible not to acknowledge the fact that the camera has come along as this very positive tool in the creation of images using paint. And it was this sort of fractious environment at the time. When I look back on it, very exciting time, but very confronting for a young bloke like me who really just wanted to make paintings and wasn't interested in dog biscuits.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I remember postmodernism and that distance between, the kind of irony or this ironic atmosphere that surrounded postmodernism, as though the death of the original and that we could never have that immediate connection with a work of art again. And a lot of that coming out, maybe out of pop art as well. And Richter was certainly, sort of rode his own little wave of pop art. But the thing that strikes me when, particularly I say with the portraits, the level of intimacy that he does manage to achieve in those works and the immediate and kind of emotional connection that you make with the works, it sort of challenges that whole distance that postmodernism sort of strives for. And so if we, I guess for both Richter and yourself, portraiture is a really huge investment in the central to the practice. And Richter, when he makes the photo paintings, seems to take us to a moment in time rather than to a character or a likeness or a subject. He, quite often the faces aren't even maybe turned away or not looking at you. They're not actually sitters. These are reproductions of photos, and yet there is that intimacy in them. And so, yeah, I wonder, what is your relationship with the practice of portraiture? Are you and do you take photographs of your sitters? Is it important to have a live sitter, or how does that work?
Yeah, so again, going back to art school, I remember then thinking all these people who are fighting against, who are saying that painting is dead, but it was fine to copy a photograph and maybe make it a bit blurry and say that it was a painting of a photograph, therefore it had a place in the postmodernist reading of contemporary art. But really they were just copying Richter. So they weren't actually even copying the photo. They were copying a photo, copying Richter. And he blew that whole idea open. In a sense, it was about reclaiming, like David Hockney in a sense. I think Hockney is another great example of someone who's taken digital technology. For those of you that know the iPad drawings, took digital technology and went, I'm going to master it so far beyond anyone's imagination that I own it. I take it back for painting. And Richter did that way before I was at art school in the early 90s. But he talks about how making a portrait making a painting of portraiture of another human being is not about finding the intimacy of the person, but he was still existing in those whole crazy, very intense paradigms of postmodernity. And I then, out of the end of that, and in the 90s, for example, when people were saying, paintings come back, all these things Richter kept making those huge screed paintings as well, that pigment does exist and you can do things with it. And now, as a young man growing up in the last 20 years, for me, painting unlike Richter saying that it had to be this distance from the subject, I'm all about finding that time with the subject. And I see portraiture, a photograph is bang, I can take a photo right then. It is an instant recording of that moment in time, but a portrait painting that takes 4 or 5 hours is a recording of 4 or 5 hours, and there's no other way to record that except with a video camera. And a painting is a static image that has this history of 4 or 5 hours in it. And that only comes out of the fact that Richter and artists like Richter went through the 90s and lead up through postmodernity and fought against the notion that painting was dead. I know that's complex, but I see that as the way it is. That now we've opened up back again, that painting is back. You know, in the 90s, no one was doing it. You were seen as it was uncool. Now everyone's doing it again. They think it's like the new cool thing to do. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? If you look back to the 80s and 90s, it was the outsider art. And unlike anything, if you tell someone something's dead, there's a reaction against that.
Yeah, of course.
People naturally fight against it. Artists inherently fight against things and rail against the status quo and against taboo and all those sorts of ideas. And therefore, painting has returned, obviously, with a vengeance. I have to say that in the 90s, I did think, I'd read so much theory that was saying that was the end of it. Really? Maybe that will be the end of it. I'll have to get a job in fucking Macca's and I'll keep painting and no one will care.
Yeah. But in a way, Richter's works are, well, I don't want to say dead, but because they're paintings of these photographs, there is that lack of relationship with a living subject. Whereas if, you know, the way you've gone into series like after Afghanistan or whatever, and you really have invested so much relationship into that work, and it becomes a living conversation with those soldiers. And do you want to talk a bit about that? How it affects your life, like, and having that living relationship?
I don't know, Richter, but you've seen the show, I assume. That room with all the catalogued images, I think he and I are pretty different. My archive is chaos, you know, and that shows, I think, the sort of person that he is. He's very rigid and controlled and brilliant. And I'm quite sociable. I like human beings. An artist is in the studio on your own, and one way of fixing that is to bring in a subject. And so a thing like Afghanistan, at first I was very concerned about going, and I thought, this is crazy, and all these questions about pro and anti-war and the complexities of the political what led to us being in Afghanistan. And I marched against the invasion of Iraq across the Harbour Bridge years and years before with my mum. I was so against that. So in a sense, it felt to me that I had to go. I had a duty to go. I was given an opportunity to go and make my own mind up. But then having the guys in front of me, and particularly those subjects, they were so loaded and hurt. And, you know, a lot of my work's been autobiographical, really, about being a young man. And my God, we need to look more at young men at the moment, don't we? At straight white men, at me, you know, about why we are doing this, what is going on the planet at the moment. It's becoming more and more obvious. It's still a very tricky thing to say because, and I see this now, it's easy to criticise other groups of people, but not straight white men, because they are really violent, they're really aggressive, they know how to use social media to really cut you down, and they're my people. That's who I am. And these young guys were the same. There was one gay guy, but the rest were straight white men. And yeah, I guess it's a very taxing thing to have that and to become friends with them and then inevitably have to walk with them down their path. But the studio for me is the place to unpick any issues that I have. And it was a real privilege, and some of them have become very close friends.
Yeah, and I guess you're very socially and politically aware and committed in central to your art practice, and as is Richter, I think. And in the exhibition there are the 4 Birkenau paintings, and that's I guess quite an incredible story behind those works. And Richter was wanting to speak about the Holocaust, and his point of entry were these 4 photographs of Birkenau in operation, and which have become the only testament of that. And so he, reproduced them in graphite, but then couldn't actually make the photo painting, and instead went to the abstraction and has obliterated any representational image, and takes us to a place beyond representation, beyond words. How can, as a kind of failed attempt, if you like, and the attempt is the important thing to get us there to even think about that event. And I guess I just found an important relationship with your practice in your Rorschach paintings, where you've attempted to depict landscapes of Aboriginal massacre sites. And so we're looking at national histories of genocide. How do we bear these in ourselves? How do we live with these histories? How do we talk about them? And what's the role of the artist and painting with that? So I just thought it would be great to hear you speak about those images as well.
To the beginning of your question, I actually think I'm hard up to name an artist who's been remembered in the fullness of time who's not an activist. I think the act of creating art is activism, and if you're only making something that's beautiful or something that's, what else is there? We're trying to talk about the world and talk about our place within it, and there's so many things to make work about that are seen as activism. But although I will say that in Australia, for the last 200 years, it hasn't been a fashionable thing to be an activist artist. Whereas people like Gerhard Richter, people around the world have been doing it the whole time we've been here. There are lots of them, but on the whole, feels to me like there's a bit of a vacuous space where it's like, don't talk about our history or don't talk about that. And now it feels to me like there's a real movement of artists trying to get rid of that idea of black armband history in Australia. And what a crazy idea that there is 2 versions of history. History is a set of facts, and if they're recorded in a certain way, obviously there's nuances and they can be written about in different ways, but things happen. And to ignore those things is insanity. It's crazy. And I think Richter, as we were talking before we came on stage, recently I wrote an opinion piece and mentioned something about Nazi ideology, and I was attacked on social media for something called the Godwin theory or something, that on a social media platform within a certain period that the Nazism will come up in conversation. It's actually a way it's a version of black armband history. It's a way of stopping people talking about that part of history in Germany. Why would you stop talking about that as long as you need to talk about it, that there is a place for that conversation? Why would you label it in a negative way that you use it to discuss anything in any place? It's like saying, don't ever talk about Indigenous massacres which happen all the way up our coast, all the way around this country, because if you do, you fit into an algorithm that says social media, you'll talk about it all the time. It's just so stupid. Yeah. And you know what? That's just like bait to me. Fuck that. I'm going to talk about that more. There's clearly a place for that to be discussed, and I'm going to keep discussing it. I went to, most of us in here went to primary school, and I didn't get taught about one single Indigenous person. I went through the public school system, not one single Indigenous person from years kindergarten to year 12. What the fuck? Are you kidding? That is a national shame that we collectively, not one child, not any of us learn about that history. And I learn about Zimbabwe in year 7, in depth about Indigenous Zimbabwe. Like, really? But nothing about Indigenous Australia.
Yeah.
And that's got to change. That has to change for us to actually become an adult nation. I get criticised for saying that it's always this pessimistic look at our history. No, that's not true. It's to add another whole layer of cultural diversity and acknowledgement and history and reconciliation makes this country a much more interesting place to live for my children and for my grandchildren. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, of course. I think perhaps I find the whole media saturation, the media sphere, is actually quite a dumbing down of social discourse, and saturation sort of muddles our brains quite a fair bit. Where once the artist may have been a kind of critical voice on the sideline, a sort of marginal figure, and maybe, a more permissive figure within the social order, somebody who's going to allow you to say things, do things that maybe are alternative or underground. I think it's really interesting that there seems to be now such a mistrust of social discourse, or maybe a failure of leadership, or mistrust in political discourse, perhaps. The artist's voice is becoming more respected, in a sense, as a voice of authenticity. Or, I mean, you're saying the opposite.
Depends who you ask.
Right. Yeah.
It depends. People who don't agree with me, I get labelled a lefty. It's like, really, that's so childish. I'm just making decisions on all of my education, on all of my experience of the world. And I think all artists are the same. We don't want to be labelled anything. We just want to be given the opportunity to have our say and say what we believe in. Because my job is to, I think an artist's job is to consider the world and respond with truth, without any bias, no political, social bias, nothing. But it still depends who you ask. And look at the state of the arts in our country at the moment. I wouldn't say that we're hugely supported. All the art schools in New South Wales are basically gone. There's 3 left. All the TAFEs in New South Wales were shut down 8 years ago. Australia Council's budget's been halved. All the international residencies are gone in the last 3 years because of George Brandis. You know, really, that's... But saying that, it's easy to catastrophise. Artists are good at that as well. And why are you laughing? And it's true. My dad always reminds me, you're catastrophising again. And I think the more we have to rail against, like Gerhard Richter, he has one massive life experience of living through the Second World War as a German. Yeah. The more you have to make work about, the more you have to rail against, the better your work will become. And I don't know that I believe that or not, but there's definitely a thing in this country that in the past, no one made work about the state of reconciliation of Indigenous and European Australians, ever. And now that is something that needs to be considered, and it actually needs to be fought, you know, down to basic things like having their rights recognised in our constitution, you know, and then further than that, the massive job of trying to bring that to a broad stream understanding of who we really are.
And bring them into the heart of that conversation, like really,
yes,
and cherish what they...
Yeah, I mean, like the constant thing about who's the most famous. I remember someone introducing Margaret Olley as the most famous living Australian painter, and I won't say who she said, but she said, well, he'd have something to say about it on stage, and she just thought that was absurd, and so do I, particularly when you meet people like Betty Pumani and Ilawanti Ken and these artists who until 5 years ago I'd never even heard of, and that's embarrassing that I didn't know who these painters were. Betty Pumani is a much better painter than most of the people who get claimed to be the best living Australian painters. She is a masterful painter, and if her career had been in Berlin, her paintings would be worth what Richter is now. I really believe that. And that's an exciting thing to realise, that I can openly talk about that now. And most of the people who disagree with it in the arts community are just racist. And it's become racism has become a really ugly label. If you're racist, you're just racist. Like, just deal with it. I have no real problem with it, but I'm going to smash you out of my way with every argument I have. But it's like become this vile thing. If you're racist, you can't blame them for being racist. Imagine being racist. It'd be a really tricky, difficult, stressful position to be in. Really. Like, I forgive them. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. You have to teach people not to be racist.
Oh, true.
You have to teach your children not to be racist. You have to teach people to be compassionate. And the person who's racist was never taught. You have to look back to their childhood and understand how that happened to them.
Tell us how you make the Rorschach paintings.
Well, my children call them squashies, and that's really all there is to it, is big squashies. And I've made my first Rorschach about 4. I just haven't stopped. I came back to it. I was trying to find another dimension, another way of making work, and at the same time trying to look at ways of making works about these sites of Indigenous massacre. And at that point, there was only 2 in the whole country that were acknowledged. And I at the end of halfway through second year, that my art lecturer said, "You're going to fail, but if you defer, we'll let you come back in 12 months." I was so furious, how dare you? But I was enjoying marijuana far too much. And I actually probably should have just been failed, to be quite honest with you. And I went away for 6 months and travelled around Australia, and I lived in Indigenous communities, and the mate I was with said, "No, this is going to be really violent." It's like, "No, really? We're the violent ones. What, are you kidding? They can't be more violent than us." And we stayed there. Then when I got back, I enrolled and did a certificate course in Indigenous culture and history. And it was via Monash University. They were the only university offering it. And I got the course books by correspondence. And the whole first semester was a study of Indigenous massacre sites. And the course reader was that thick. Wow. And it was a recording of every single massacre that had happened that was recorded. They were all recorded. It wasn't illegal. This is what happened. You need to record it. And at the time, I think I'm interested in the histories of how we are coming to reconciliation and how those things are working. And at that time in the early 90s, people were still denying that there was any such thing as a massacre. And Keith Windschuttle's someone who I'd suggest you read for a denier, like a Holocaust denier. He denies that that ever happened. Don't buy the book. You have to steal the book if you're going to get one. You're happy? Maybe don't put it on social media that I said that. But he was John Howard's chief historical advisor. Wow. Yeah. So there was things to rail against back then. Yeah. And so then I realised that the Rorschachs were the first one I made. When you have a canvas and you can afford more expensive linen, the linen's quite expensive, and when you scrape, if you make a bad painting, if you decide that it's bad enough early enough, you can scrape it off and get a smooth surface and reuse that linen. And I used a particularly fine linen, so a smooth surface. When I scraped it off, it left this incredible shroud of Turin-like, haunting, ghost-like image underneath, because linen picks the pigment up, and any single thin layer above that is sitting on top of the first stain. So if you scrape it back to the first stain, you get the original impression. So when you squash them together, if you scrape off the copied side, you get an exact copy of the original painting. And it just opened up all these possibilities. And I thought there was a religious connotation about the Shroud of Turin with these Indigenous sites. I'm very careful not to tell Indigenous stories, but a massacre site is intrinsically about us as well as them. And I felt that I had every right to make those paintings. In fact, a kind of duty to make those paintings.
Mm. In the Atlas overview room of the Richter show, that's an incredible archive, isn't it? But it's almost like Richter has a witness-bearing practice over his lifetime. He's sort of gathering these images that have circulated around him that he feels are significant. And I guess, while you may not have this tidy archive, there is a kind of witness-bearing nature to your work as well. And do you think that that's central to an artistic practice, or is it just something important to you?
It's back to the question of whether what art is, and for me, it's it's activism. You're responding, and some of Ai Weiwei's one of my great heroes. there's people, lots of people that I respect, and they're all making work that's, in a sense, responding to the crisis in the world. And all my favourite artists instantly started responding to the crisis coming out of Syria, all of them. And I continue to do that. Sorry, what was the crux of that question again?
Just witness bearing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, I mean, what you've done going to Syria.
That came out of Afghanistan. And I guess if you go and do something like I did in Afghanistan, and I hope that one performer actually, who's a musician, said, "I think it's just pro-war that you even went there," and I'm in awe of what he does, And I thought about, and he said it in a constructive way, and I thought about it and took it away. But the difference between me and him is and he was asked to go and perform for the troops, but you're just there to perform. Whereas I got to take it away, take as long as I want, and respond in any way I wanted. And it is an amazing program that the War Memorial runs, really almost anti-establishment, because there's not many artists who are going to come away and make paintings that are pro-war after an experience like that. And then out of that, then I sort of became the go-to guy. I get offered to do some crazy things in war zones now, and I don't want that to define me anymore, that's for sure. But going to Syria was definitely one of the questions that was pertinent and right, was why didn't I tell the story of the Afghan people when I went to Afghanistan? And that's simply because it was far too dangerous to go anywhere near any Afghan people, because the people would have been targets, I would have been a target. I was stuck within the confines of the ADF, which was an extraordinary experience in itself, to see that from inside young men's lives that live in Brisbane and all over Australia. To see that form of my masculinity living in a place like that and learning Pashtun was life-changing. But I don't want... So then when I was offered to go back with Richard Flanagan asked me to go, and he rang up, and I thought he was trying to talk... He wanted me to talk him out of going it, and I said, yes, we're going, mate. Are you kidding? That's an amazing experience, and it's with World Vision, and it's there's no war where we're going. It was just to be with these people, and that was far more profound than being in a war zone.
Well, it's a fantastic essay that Richard's written, and that is available in the book. And and was that like an artistic collaboration? Would you say that? Was it a creative?
Well, yes. Look, I think Richard thought it would be like this adventure between the two of us, and we ended up standing on the beach in Lesbos, and we were bawling our eyes out, and it was just horrific what we'd seen. And I think we both thought, what are we doing here? And I think it's only the beginning. The book was one essay, which was he actually wrote for The Guardian, and we're now working on a much bigger publication, but it's all about children's drawings. We have thousands of children's drawings, and that's a much bigger project. And I think something like that could take years to come out properly. And I felt that they needed to tell their story. It's not for me to make paintings about that while it's still going. I can go away and think about it, and as hard as I thought about it, I thought I've just got to keep putting pencils in children's hands and let them tell the story.
Yeah.
So really I'm just facilitating that. Richard's got to write the essay, he's got the hard job. I don't know if he's going to write like a child or not, I haven't asked him that.
So in a sense you've become a curator, or is it a mentoring, I guess? Do you have contact with the children?
Yeah, I've been going back and forwards, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so we've got drawings from everywhere, in Syria and northern Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and I've been to all of them except Syria. I didn't go into Syria. Promised my family I wouldn't do that. And then in Germany, some still stuck in concentration camps, sorry, it's not the right word, whatever they call it on Manus Island, that form of concentration. In Serbia, there's people held all over. When they shut the gates into Germany, everywhere that people were, they were stopped. And for example, in Lesbos, they had a big fence built around the camp as the people moved out of the water into a camp on their way to Germany. And when Germany stopped, the minute they stopped, they just locked the gate and locked the people in. And they're still there. And that's across the world. Manus isn't the only place like that. We have a very different take on it because those people have been there for a lot longer. But I'd worked with all the children. I worked with the children who are now in those camps in Lesbos, and I have those drawings. The only drawing I can't get is a child who was on Manus, but if any of you know that, get that for me. It's not to politicise it, it's about my story. I was offered to go to Manus Island too, but it's much trickier. I got turned down. My visa was turned down, but I'll try again.
Does this come out of maybe your relationship with Myron Sukumara and the mentoring of him, and the ongoing maybe?
I didn't mean to mentor Myron. He, yeah, that was a funny one. I don't know how I got myself there, to be quite honest with you.
He approached you, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He wrote and asked, and I was so intrigued by that first letter that I said, I'm really interested in your story, and I want to come and visit. And then it just went from there. I was so blown away by who this person was. It was years before he was killed. And all my work, as I said, is about my masculinity. And it had struck me before then that if Myron was like Chappelle and he didn't have brown skin, he would be in a very different position, probably with a lot more hope. And it's no point talking critically about people, but Chappelle, in the Indonesian legislation, you have to admit your guilt and apologise to be given a reduced sentence. Chappelle's the only one in contemporary history in Indonesia who hasn't admitted her guilt and didn't apologise and still got a reduced sentence. And I think that all comes down to the fascination that Indonesian people have with white women. And nothing against Chappelle, as I said. She was in a horrific situation, had a pretty hard childhood from everything I understand. A lot of things went wrong. But Myron became an amazing young man in prison, and had such a harsh... I mean, I guess it goes to my fighting against the idea of the racist... If I hear another Prime Minister or a politician say, we are not a racist country, fucking hell, seriously? Try being an Aboriginal for a day, or try being a Vietnamese kid in my primary school for a day. Try having any different coloured skin in this country for one day, and then at the end of that day tell me it's not a racist country. It's absurd. An absolutely absurd thing to say. Or we're the best country in the world. Have you actually been anywhere else? I don't want to be critical. I'm so lucky to be alive and so lucky to be here. But we have a lot of problems. Yeah. We don't even acknowledge the people that owned this country for 60,000 years before us. And philosophically, for me, that makes it maybe a bit, my link to the best country in the world mantle, a bit tenuous.
Do you feel like, I don't know how to articulate the fact that I get the sense that Richter is incredibly European. You know, like when and this European history that he has come out of, and do you feel connected to that and part of that continuum of... No. Oh, that's interesting. But he would have been an influence on you.
Oh, absolutely. No, look, there's great influences. You know, some of the great paintings I've seen are from Richter and Picasso and all of Diebenkorn. You know, I looked at Diebenkorn a lot as a young man. He's American, mind you. But I guess I was more interested in this place and the problems with this place. They're interesting. They're a challenge, I guess. And if it was the most beautiful place in the world, if it was the best place in the world, there'd be no challenges. So I'm glad there are challenges, or I probably wouldn't stay here.
Well, shall we ask these guys to open it out and see if they want to ask us some questions? Does anyone have questions for Ben? We've got a roving mic, so if you just wait, you'll...
I guess it's easy to be distracted by the kind of wonderful end product, but I guess my query is about like your art practice and how you come about. Obviously, it was about nearly failing, and that drove you to learn more about Aboriginal history, our own history. and I guess what it is that keeps pushing you to keep going on to that next discovery, that next subject, the next thing. What's the kind of drive or art practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. A year ago yesterday, Donald Trump got in. That day was a big day for me. I thought, wow, I'm not going to live long enough for this.
That was the day you ate the raw onion.
I did.
wasn't
I
it?
didn't know what to do.
God.
I really didn't know what to do. I couldn't believe it. And by chance that day, there was a huge thunderstorm away to the west of my studio, and the light was really bright orange in the studio. And I walked to my kids' school and brought them back to the studio, and I told them, and they're just like, "What are you talking about? We played soccer today, and I'm hungry, and I've got a bit of play lunch left in my bag." And I thought, I really don't know what to do. I really have no idea what to do. And I'm interested I listen probably to too much current affairs, and I was listening to the radio all day, and I stopped doing that. It's bad for you. But I worked in news and current affairs. I was an editor in TV stations and stuff like that. And I did eat an onion that day. I made my son record me, and my daughter started crying because she thought I'd lost it completely. And you can hear her sobbing a little bit, and Joe sort of giggling. And you can't eat an onion. I mean, really, it comes to the point of who gets our prime ministership in this country. He ate that fucking onion, the whole thing. I couldn't swallow one bite of the onion. And I tried, and it's still on Facebook, and I tried to swallow it, and it made me vomit. And that seemed like a perfectly reasonable response to the election of Donald Trump. And then all of the paintings have been really inadvertently about that chaos. And all of my work's been about my own masculinity, and I was coming here today thinking about all the crazy things that we did as young men. Really insane, stupid, mad things. But I had a pretty stable home. I try to look back at the things that went wrong. I went to a Catholic boys' school. Things went really wrong when I was 12. Today was the first time I thought it wasn't sexual violence, but it was absolutely, I was assaulted the whole of Year 7. And that was probably a turning point. But then so I've always made work about masculinity, and now it feels like now I've got to go harder and fight against this. What is going on with the world, really? What is happening to the world? What are men doing? And I studied I did another undergraduate degree, and I enrolled in feminist theory. And I was at the University of Western Sydney, and I was the only man, and they were all much younger. I was about 28, all younger women. They all looked at me. I think they thought they were coming there to do a cooking course. And they all looked at me and said, what are you doing here? It's like, and the lecturer, this incredible woman in her 60s at the time, who's become someone I've stayed in contact with, said, Ben's probably the only one here for the right reasons. If he wants to understand his masculinity, you have to understand the feminist movement. And that was right to the point of what's the problem at the moment. The feminist movement came through our West, rightfully so, but there was never enough attention paid to the psychotic white, straight men who still find themselves floundering. So I find that there's enough work there for me. You just turn the mirror on yourself. There it is again. Oh, fuck, there it is again. Any other questions? Sorry, that was a long answer.
Maybe he was also asking what's driving your painting practice in a formalist sense, like experimenting with the medium, or like what you're about in the studio, like how you stimulate like the next.
Well, so it's a good question. On top of your question, I've been trying to find a way to make paintings about Donald Trump without making a painting about Donald Trump. I don't want him to ever think I've wasted 1 second thinking about him. So about a week ago, I thought it's got to be some white man that is a symbol of that everyone knows in the world. And I was thinking Jesus, but I don't want it to be religious. I'm actually there's the white men who believe in any religious ideology are dangerous. Every single religious ideology, including Buddhists now, it's proven now. So I thought, who's not got the capacity to have me killed? Santa Claus. Seriously. So I've been making paintings of Santa Claus the last 2 weeks. They are pretty weird and dark. I've made him really, really dark. And so that's the sort of where I'm going. The subject, and Santa, I don't even need a subject. For the last 2 years, everything in my studio has been with a model, and any human being, and then sort of build armature onto them about the troubles of the world, as though every subject is carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. But Santa, you don't need the person there. Everyone knows what Santa looks like. I can make it up, and that's quite liberating. I don't know where I'll go from Santa. Maybe the Easter Bunny. I know it's not a man.
All right. Anyone else? Game to take this on?
You have to excuse my ignorance, but I'd be really interested because are there women doing what you do? Like, I know, like you're famous, and you hear Maestri and people like that. I can't think of any women other than Indigenous women. Could you tell me some who are painting like political? I mean, yours is a white male voice, as you say. Is there a white?
Well, look, I'll be
voice
honest with you. If I was a female, I'd be scared to make critical comments about straight white men. I have friends like Hannah Gadsby, and I have some great friends who are women who have railed against it. And Hannah Gadsby has copped serious physical threats on social media, and that's the ugly truth. And therefore, I do have a responsibility to talk very openly about my own straight white masculinity. But there are great painters in Australia making good paintings who are women. Del Catherine Barton, I think is one of the great painters of our time. And her work's less about the politics of, I guess it is about the politics of gender, about her sexuality and femininity and all those things. Yeah, there are lots of women making great paintings. Fiona Lowry, I think, is one of the great painters. All of her work actually is about violence inflicted on women. So she does it in the thing to do is make it beautiful. If you make it so beautiful, the story can be as dark. If you make it ultimately beautiful, the dark story can be hidden within it. And then it's much smarter. You won't get threatened by mad people.
Yeah, well, that's the job of art, I think, is to make the really difficult subjects palatable for us. So artists have that amazing ability to represent stuff that we can't deal with, and then all of a sudden, okay, I can see it, I can look at this, I can think about this now. But otherwise, most of us are going around repressing this stuff, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's a pretty important job.
Yeah, the idea of taboo, I think that's the fertile ground for making good art. If it's taboo, then why? What is it that we can't talk about these things? And there's contentious issues that I still am trying to get my head around how to make work about, but the violence against children and pedophilia, in our community, we have this obsession with pedophiles. And I had a conversation with a very smart friend of mine recently who said, I believe in return of the death penalty. And I looked at him and thought, you really seriously going to try and argue this with me? And he said, only for pedophiles. It's like, really, something like 99% of pedophiles were abused as children. So isn't there a bigger question about the way this... You wipe them out, you're not allowed to talk about it. Bill Henson's photographs are off limit. But Bill Henson's making comments about the time that, from that time of greatest flux as a human body, from childhood to adulthood, it's all about that we're not allowed to look at that. And when I now have an 11-year-old, and he's approaching this age where his body is off limits to the whole community, but we want him to have a healthy self-body image. How those two things don't work together. I'm not saying their naked forms should be everywhere, but to illegalise their human form is such a stupid, small-minded thing to do. And it's a bigger discussion. But the way the political system's set up, we're not good at discussing anything at the moment.
No.
It's impossible to talk about taboo without falling into left-right arguments and the fraught nature of the political system, I think.
Well, let alone young people who are having transgender problems,
yes.
or, actually having serious issues about
yes.
trying to fit in. And we know how difficult it is, and how the education system's failing. But we might be getting better at it, do you think?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm a really healthily positive pessimist. I do. I think that's important. You've got to be critical. You've got to stand up for things. But I love being alive. You know, my parents taught me about the universe very early, about what a tiny blip we are, and if you can make a small dent in this place being better, then what else is there to do except enjoy being alive?
Any further questions? Oh, great. Oh, can you just wait for the microphone? Sorry.
I suppose harking back to your being an optimistic pessimist, I always think that a good piece of art shows anguish I read once that it shows anguish and its resolution. And I think in your essay for the most recent series on for the Last Supper paintings, it suggested that it's bad, but there's some good at the end. Do you strive to put some resolution into the darker paintings and that kind of thing?
Yes, look, there's sometimes where it's just got to be dark. There's some things, I think a painting's got to be read in context of a body of work. And you can get away with going really dark if there's moments of lightness. And look, Gerhard Richter, my goodness, that little painting of flowers, you can read all you want into that, read all the theories about what that means. But it is a moment of pure, beautiful respite in that show. But saying that, the works about the concentration camp also have a beautiful quality to them. I think the best paintings, I go to Guernica by Picasso. People say, oh yeah, but that was a beautiful painting. No, it wasn't. Your reading of it now is that it was a beautiful painting. It's an incredibly confronting, grotesque, ugly painting. But and that's the beauty of paint, that the material that's dug out of the ground and ground down to perform this magic is a beautiful thing. And you can tell very dark stories by using it. Did that answer it?
I think so. Do you ever have something that's too dark?
Yes.
You just can't.
Yeah.
Then doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also one of the other ways, and maybe this is just an Australian thing, and I think it probably is definitely an Australian thing, is if you can use humour. And Santa Claus, there's a funny side to it. You all laugh. That's good. That's the first time I've said it outside the studio. They're really confrontingly dark, ugly paintings of big fat men with white guts and cigarettes and dirty beards. But it's funny. It's Santa.
Well, some of the scariest works I've seen of yours have been your self-portraits, actually. Like, I just go, whoa, what's going on there? I mean...
I challenge any of you to look in the mirror for 1 hour and stare at yourself and think that human beings are normal. We are so out there. Things like where the hair grows. I mean, why does it stop there? Why doesn't it grow down there? Like, really, what's the gap? What's that gap there? Everything. And when you start looking in the mirror, it becomes a very intense thing. And for me, I did rely on photographs. And that finished, actually, there was one reviewer who's never really liked my work, who criticised my use of photography in the paintings. And I understand it, but there was paintings that I was making of my crying baby as a 3-month-old in a cot. And I'd walk in the middle of the night feeling like I was going to die and take a photo of it. And if I did it without my wife catching me photographing him rather than picking him up, I could take that photograph and make a painting that you can't make. You can't make a painting of that baby crying without the photograph. But then I've let go of that, and more, the more I've let go of the use of those images, the more I've found my own language. And you need a subject, and if you don't have a subject, you just need a mirror. And they're intense. Try it. You should all try. Everyone should paint.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, actually, because that is the profound difference, perhaps, between you and Richter. So he's never let go of those photographs. I mean, well, nor should he. But, you're on a different trajectory.
Well, as I said before, he's a product of his time and generation, and he had to fight right up through the Industrial Revolution, bringing an end to the idea that painting would never be questioned, whereas I've come after postmodernity and there's absolute freedom. Yeah.
Thanks, Gerhard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you, Ben and Beth. I was dying to ask a question, but it was unfair for me to do so. But when you were talking about the surface of your painting, Ben, and you were talking about tough stories, there's a quote by Richter which really sticks with me, and I'll badly misquote it, but it's something like at one stage he was trying to use a dry brush to erase history. And to me, I walk through the show in certain parts and I see a dry brush trying to erase history. Very different, but thank you. But look, I knew it was going to be a wide-ranging discussion, and so I took the liberty on my phone just to list the subjects that Ben and Beth traversed, just to give you a quick sense of where we've been in the last 45 minutes. We've done postmodernism and the death of painting and photography, reconciliation, social media, success and failure in the art school experience, the role of art, artists as activists, art and war and being a war artist, refugee situation as told especially by children's drawings and indeed children, the Mediterranean situation, Manus Island, Bali story, out-of-body experience and numbness of Donald Trump, Santa Claus, hair, the universe, but there's a couple of things that Ben continued to move back onto, and that was masculinity, which of course is a huge issue in this country, as he points out. But finally, the absolute joy of paint and the joy of Richter keeps coming back through and through, which is lucky because this program is about Gerhard Richter, so that's a bit of a wee. With that said, and all the way through, Beth has led the discussion or navigated the discussion or was just so eloquent all the way through. So would you please join with me to thank Ben and Beth for a great evening?